How Astrology Works, from the book Man and the Stars, Interview with Astrology, by Ciro Discepolo, Edizioni Ricerca 90, Milan, 822 pages, 2023. Paola Canatello. I believe we have passed the 300-page mark and are still in the first part of the book, or rather the section we could call Astrology and Science. You told me that you would dwell at length on this part, and I absolutely agree with you, because I too believe that it is a fundamental basis of Interview with Astrology. So continuing along this line, I would like to refer to something you said many pages ago about Newton's law of gravitation. In that paragraph you stated, roughly speaking, it is not up to us astrologers to explain how and why astrology works. Rather, it should be up to physicists and astrophysicists to explain it to us. Agreed, but I know you have formed an opinion on the subject. Would you like to share it with us? Ciro Discepolo. Gladly, and so I will share with you my thoughts on what we might call the Caligari Palmieri Emilio del Giudice Nicola del Giudice Ciro Discepolo theory on the functioning of astrology, but also of solar revolutions and lunar revolutions, targeted and non-targeted, how astrology works. This is clearly a question and not an answer. In this regard, I would like to point out to readers that a general update on my thinking, my school, and my books is collected in 80 high-resolution video lessons, mostly 4K, that form the basis of my annual active astrology courses. Not everyone can enroll in these courses, but those interested can request information directly from me by writing an email to ciro@discepoloegmail.com. Summarizing this would be very difficult, but above all useless, since the videos are available in full size. By watching them all, you can get a fairly accurate idea of what I believe today, after celebrating my professional jubilee, 1970-2020, of boundless love for astrology in relation to its origins, its mechanisms of operation, the methods of verifying them, and more. But I want to make a really big effort and throw out two topics for you to think about in relation to how astrology might work. The first really important idea came from Professor Giovan Battista Caligari right at the beginning of my astrology studies, an extraordinary man whom I had the pleasure of spending time with for a couple of years, even several times a week. Caligari, the father of radionics and Caligari radiobiology, talked to me mainly about physics and science, and I listened to him for hours, spellbound. One of the things that struck me most was this sentence: in interplanetary space, which we consider empty, even though it is not really empty, the impedance is zero and therefore distance has no value. A colossal, gigantic truth. In a nutshell, and referring to our beloved subject, it translates as follows. If within our solar system the impedance to the passage of electromagnetic waves is zero, this means that distance no longer has any value, which explains why Pluto, despite being abysmally more distant than Mars, for example, from Earth, functions exactly the same as Mars does in relation to us. The second point of enormous importance for the explanation of the possible functioning of astrology was given to us by the brothers Emilio and Nicola del Giudice in various books, and especially during a magnificent conference that I promoted in Vico Equense in June 2005, June 3, 4, and 5, which was attended by great free men of science and general culture. In the roundtable discussion we organized on that occasion, brilliantly led by our colleague and friend Andrea Rossetti, CNR physicist Emilio del Giudice, who had been studying the memory of water for many years with his brother Nicola, a homeopathic doctor, explained to us roughly At the moment of birth, a child is governed by the stars of the mother. Then, when his breathing becomes autonomous, the stellar magnetic field present there is imprinted in its water molecules, which make up over 65% of its person, and due to the principle of water memory, this information will remain within it forever, representing its astral DNA. He also explained that this is similar to the creation of a homeopathic medicine. When we dilute a drop of mother substance in 100 drops of distilled water, we also imprint energy onto the test tube, read electromagnetic waves. And in this way we fix the therapeutic action contained in the drop of mother substance. Due to the principle of water memory, the homeopathic medicine will forever retain the characteristics of the substance from which we started, even after reaching the 100,000th centesimal dilution, and the whole thing will not be cancelled out by the famous Avogadro number. How solar and lunar revolutions work. A question I have asked myself many times, and which just as many times has been asked of me by readers or people attending my seminars and conferences, is the following. According to what physical or universal principle is it possible to frame the functioning of solar and lunar revolutions and accept already in theory that they can actually work? Leaving aside what I have repeated many times, namely that astrologers who have successfully experimented with the functioning of SRs and MLs thousands of times should not care much about where the theoretical justification for this comes from. Over the years, I have developed my own theory, which seems to have been validated by many schools of thought, both strictly scientific and non-scientific. We know, for example, that the great Carl Gustav Jung discussed at length whether astrology should be framed according to the principle of cause and effect or that of synchronicity. He also worked on this together with Nobel Prize winner for physics Wolfgang Ernst Pauli, and all his doubts on the subject became pervasive in his work, starting with his study on synchronicity, one, and continuing with all his subsequent publications in which he touched on this subject. Until shortly before his death, as Emma Baumann-Jung to herself writes, he remained doubtful about this strange thing that is astrology, but never about its validity, rather about whether it should be framed as a causal phenomenon or a synchronic phenomenon. Unfortunately, the great Zurich psychologist and thinker left us with this doubt. Personally, for some years now, I've become increasingly convinced that, as far as our beloved discipline is concerned, we should lean towards a causalistic explanation. I will shortly explain my entire thinking, especially with regard to solar and lunar revolutions, but first I will give you what I consider to be an important gift, a series of articles that appeared between 2005 and 2007 in my quarterly magazine Ricerca 90, articles that I believe are of exceptional importance, especially when read together in the coherent aspects that run through them in what today would be called a cross-cutting alignment that unites them. I believe that the dates between June 3 and 5, 2005 will go down in astrology history. During these 3 days, the 12th annual astrology conference, promoted by Ricerca 90 and held in Vico Equense, NA, some alternative scientists gave us presentations of extraordinary interest. These exceptional scholars, whom I would like to thank once again for their invaluable contribution, a special thought goes to my teacher and friend, Vincenzo Di Napoli, who is no longer with us, sat down at the same table without knowing each other beforehand, and illustrated some aspects of a possible vision of the world and its laws, a Weltanschauung, which, if read according to a criterion that I will propose later, and which takes part of what each of them taught us, could really be the basis for a general theory on the possible functioning of astrology, never hypothesized until now, and in my opinion, very interesting and convincing. Below then I leave you to read their reports and what they wrote later in Ricerca 90, and then I will comment on them for you. It is Science That Should Validate Itself by Renato Palmieri, 3. As always happens at conferences on heretical disciplines, when the question of their relationship with official science arises, they are prepared to ask for their own validation on the basis of the principles of current doctrines, whereas the question should be reversed, and academic science should instead be asked to offer its credentials on the basis of heretical principles. The paradox is only apparent because it is precisely the anomalies presented by so-called scientific heresies that are the Achilles heel of the normal paradigm, which is unable to explain them in any way and therefore limits itself to denying them. A prime example is cold fusion, which in 1989 triggered a worldwide proliferation of experiments confirming it, which were then gradually stifled by theoretical resistance, but above all by the economic and power resistance of the establishment. Two arguments can be put on the table in the forum where we have now gathered. Astrology seeks its actual motivations in two orders of influences, such as those of a gravitational or electromagnetic nature. Let us then see what current science actually knows about the essence of gravitation and electromagnetism. Well, it is easy to show that it knows absolutely nothing. 1. In this conference, the zodiac is our daily bread. The zodiac presupposes the ecliptic. The plane of the ecliptic is that of the entire solar system, with an axis centered on the sun and a vast equatorial plane on which the planets rotate, the large planets with their entire retinue of satellites, Saturn with its rings, etc. This structure as a whole has a disc-like shape, similar to that of the immense galactic disks, with a general counterclockwise or clockwise rotation with respect to the two north and south poles of the central axis. This immediately obvious characteristic has a very clear name: dipolarity, and it is unambiguously present in every celestial body of sufficient size. Yet it is incredibly ignored in terms of gravitation in all books on theoretical physics, cosmology, and the history of science, starting with the theorems of Kepler and Newton, through Cavendish's experiment to measure the gravitational constant, up to Einstein, and is even denied when discussing spherical symmetry and the unipolar field of gravitation. See Phillips, La Geofisica, Biblioteca Este Mondatori, Parsha 168. This means that all the discussions and calculations that have been made or are made on gravitation are approximate, so much so that the so-called constant g of gravitation is calculated with only 3 significant digits, 6.67, compared to the 8 or 9 digits of other cosmological constants. 2. I have 2 magnetic chess pieces with me, a king and a queen. They have the same pole, since the opposite pole is on the chessboard. Let's place the 2 pieces side by side at the base. It is immediately apparent that the so-called repulsion between them does not manifest itself along an axis, as one might imagine in any physics book, but with a rotational sliding, for which no theory could give us a reason. Well, this phenomenon is completely identical to the behavior of a comet with a very elongated ellipse, which when it reaches its perihelion also slides around the sun and then returns to outer space with an overall movement that no one would dream of defining as repulsive with respect to the sun. It follows that the general picture of the knowledge accredited by current science in the face of so-called heretical knowledge is similar to Bruegel's painting entitled The Parable of the Blind. The leader of the rope team, who has already fallen into the pit, is academic science, despite Popper's falsificationism, rightly branded in the previous speech by Professor Emilio del Giudice. The blind who follow him, if they do not decide to detach themselves from the rope team as soon as possible, will be the heretical disciplines that seek his support. To conclude with a general proposal, I would invite you to establish the CIKN as a counterbalance to the infamous CIKP, that is, the Italian Committee for the Control of Normal Science Activities, to whose judgment it would be appropriate to submit many of the most striking articles in the academic journal Le Scienze Vico-Equense, June 4, 2005, De Fibonacci, Pyramids and Surroundings, by Vincenzo di Napoli. 4. This note is intended as a continuation of what I said some time ago about the implications of the fatal Fibonacci number in the field of architecture. The dimensioning of building elements, according to the classic golden ratio both in plan and elevation, has important implications in the field of Hertzian microwaves. A building element with its plano-altimetric conformation constructs a volume that behaves like a resonant box at frequencies that often fall within those corresponding to the different colors of the Helmholtz spectrum. The induction of these frequencies is cosmogeophysical in nature, and their value depends not only on size, but also on the shape and orientation of the building element in space. At this point, we should note that these frequencies, in the case of dimensions based on golden ratios, fall within the orange-yellow range. How ancient architects achieved these results remains a mystery. To understand their importance, it should be noted that according to chromotherapy medical theories, all colors from orange-yellow to red are bioaccelerators, and all those towards violet are bioretarders. It follows that orange-yellow corresponds to stasis. This opens a new chapter in environmental hygiene, which also considers the nature of building materials, in particular the sand used in concrete, and the color of interior walls. Therefore, when designing new buildings or renovating existing ones, the problem arises of finding a technique that allows the following elements to be determined and measured. 1. Sensitivity to cosmogeophysical radiation of environments due to their plano-altimetric conformation. 2. Nature of the materials to be used in construction. 3. Color of the walls enclosing the rooms. If the volume of the room can be inscribed in a sphere, the accumulation of energy can also be studied on a graph representing its planimetry, which is what I have personally done using the Caligari machine as a Hertzian microwave detector. See previous issues of this magazine. Its technique of use will be discussed in a future issue of this magazine. At this point, allow me to digress, both because of the historical nature of my research and because of the resulting astrological implications. I originally turned my attention to these topics when I set out to investigate some still unknown aspects of the Egyptian pyramids. By constructing a model based on the same module, ratio between the perimeter and twice the height as the Pyramid of Cheops, I discovered that its resonant volume was around the yellow-orange frequency and that it varied more or less depending on the orientation and the day. This implied important considerations. 1. The builders were well aware that the magnitude of the inducing cosmo-geophysical energy was a function of the plano-altimetric dimensions, too, and that it varied with the orientation towards certain constellations, which, if nothing else, testifies to their perfect knowledge of astrology. Wanting to make sense of all this, I hypothesized that the explanation could only lie in the purpose for which these mammoth constructions were built, which was undoubtedly the perfect preservation of the mummies of the pharaohs. Now, the preservation of corpses involved a fight against the enemies of flesh that cause decay, namely water and microorganisms, fungi. To combat water, a biopsy was performed to empty the corpse of all its internal organs, which were replaced with cotton wool soaked in perfumes, and the exterior was wrapped in cotton bandages soaked in sea salt. The energy accumulated in the pyramid acted against the microorganisms which, as we have seen, fell around a color close to orange-yellow, rendering them inert and therefore dormant. This explains, for example, the misadventures of the French archaeologists who were the first to violate the pyramids and remove some mummies, which were then exhibited at the Louvre in Paris. In fact, once inside the pyramids, they were attacked by microorganisms, which, once outside, regained their virulence, even causing the death of some members of the expedition, later explained as the curse of the pharaoh. The astrological consequence is that it would be useful and interesting to analyze the geocosmic energy levels according to the day and time, working on photos of the sky using the Caligari control unit. This would be further confirmation of the physical and scientific foundations of astrology. I propose to carry out research in this regard, hoping to present some results in future issues of this magazine. The Fibonacci sequence is a sequence of natural integers that can be defined by assigning the values of the first two terms, F0, 0, and F1 in 1, and requiring that for each subsequent term, Fn plus Fn2. The sequence takes its name from the 13th century Pisan mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci, and the terms of this sequence are called Fibonacci numbers. Fibonacci's intention was to find a law that described the growth of a rabbit population. It is assumed that each rabbit takes 1 month to become fertile, and that each fertile pair of rabbits produces 1 pair of offspring per month. So if we start with a single pair, after 1 month we will have 2 pairs, only one of which is fertile. In the following month, we will have 2 plus 1, 3 pairs, because only the fertile pair has given birth. And of these 3, 2 will now be fertile pairs. So in the following month, there will be 3 plus 2 or 5 pairs. In this way, the number of pairs of rabbits each month describes the Fibonacci sequence. The first 41 Fibonacci numbers are 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, drift 10, 89, 144, 233, 377, 610, 987, 587, 254, 41, 81, 765, 20, 946, 771, 287, 4368, 745, 239, 39, 3781, 5429, 340, F30, 34, 629, 239, 384, 508, 528, 79, 265, 49, 32, 207, 7, 39, 1, 6, 131, 50, in Sloan's years, the Fibonacci sequence has the symbol A is or over. Fibonacci numbers have an astonishing range of properties, are found in mathematical models of various phenomena, and can be used for many computational procedures. They also have various interesting generalizations. A scientific journal, the Fibonacci Quarterly, is dedicated specifically to these as topics. From Wikipedia. Notes, edited by CD. 1. Those who have studied chromotherapy know that if a person has, say, an inflamed molar, applying a red scarf to the affected jaw would be like throwing gasoline on the fire. On the contrary, a patch with a color closer to violet, on the other side of the electromagnetic wave frequency spectrum, could certainly alleviate the patient's pain. 2. Here, in my opinion, we are faced with another topical passage of enormous importance in the discussion that Professor Di Napoli and his illustrious colleagues have been having on these pages for months now. In my opinion, they are uncovering extraordinary truths of knowledge uncontaminated by the blind fundamentalist hatred of some pseudoscientists driven by prejudice or worse, in the pay of someone. The author refers generically to constellations, but we astrologers know that the discussion relates to the passage of the stars along the ecliptic. These few lines are of extraordinary importance because they allow us to understand wonderful aspects of the functioning of the universe, the earth, the stars, and their mutual interactions. Anyone, and I mean anyone, can see for themselves that by building a small pyramid using the numbers suggested by Mr. Di Napoli, they will observe, for example, the prodigy of the apple cut in two. Place one half under a transparent plexiglass pyramid built according to the model of Cheops's pyramid. Place the other half of the apple under another pyramid built with incorrect measurements. After a few days, you will observe that the first has been perfectly preserved and the second is completely rotted. At this point, I am completely convinced that the latest issues of Ricerca 90 contain information of fundamental importance for understanding astrology and how it works. The foundations have also been laid, as suggested by Pino Valente, Giuseppe Caligari, and others, for a possible verification, using the Caligari control unit, of the frequencies on the Caligari scale relating to the various stars and their possible future use. The idea that one day we will be able to replace a specific birthday in the laboratory seems to me to be much more than a science fiction novel idea. Once again, we are extremely grateful to Mr. Di Napoli for giving us such gems of knowledge. Caligari Radionics and Astrology by Giuseppe Caligari. 5. I fully agree with those, such as the distinguished Professor Palmieri and others who have preceded me, who affirm that astrology has a life of its own and does not need anyone's official consent. Emilio Segre, Nobel Prize winner for physics and discoverer of the antiproton, publicly declared during a conference on 20th century physics that without the courage of men capable of thinking and reasoning in an anti-traditionalist and anti-conformist way, detaching themselves from the so-called fundamental laws, we would not have radio, television, telephones, airplanes, space flights today. And this is whenever practical experience advised us not to take into account or even to consider questionable some established certainties of official science, science that still today wants to ignore, or at least pretends to ignore, the existence of other science, that which runs parallel to it, that which amazes and excites you, that makes you rejoice in the beauty of creation, that makes you dream and fantasize, that lifts the spirit, that which should be brought to everyone's attention, starting from the school benches. Giambattista Caligari, father of radionics, reminds us that the results of experience, irrefutably verified, take precedence over theoretical propositions. Theories in general can be considered with a certain detachment, leaving it to time to affirm them, to refine them based on the results of new experiences, or to discard them. Theories can change, but the facts and results of experience remain and cannot be ignored. But as is easy to guess, there is a precise will above the man in the street that works tenaciously against this in order to keep the strings of profit firmly in hand, whatever the cost. And it is clear to everyone what is happening systematically in the world, from the most absurd wars to the most dissolute abandonment of suffering populations, despite the unbridled consumerism of many who are even at risk of disappearing, to reckless deforestation and massive deforestation, with the consequent elimination of that great gift that God has given us. The green of plants and trees, in addition to being a pulsating reservoir of oxygen and chlorophyll, is a natural defense against the continuous and constant bombardment of neutrons from the cosmos. I wonder, where are the powerful, the heads of state, those who matter? Are they really absent, concerned only with business, political and otherwise, intent on clinging to power at any cost? I apologize for this digression, but I believe it is important not to lose sight of certain issues, especially when we are intent on discussing others as pleasant and fascinating as those that astrology offers us today on this beautiful day in Vico Equense. So let's return to our topic. Possible hypotheses on how astrology works. 6,000 years ago, an enlightened Chinese man, Fo Hai, stated that man is the synthesis between the celestial forces and the forces of the earth. In fact, in particular, the celestial bodies constitute reference points for the motion of the earth in the cosmos. This motion corresponds to periodic energy variations in space, which affect phenomena involving both inorganic and organic matter, and therefore in particular man. In other words, there are variations in the force fields that affect man. From G. Calegari. My opinion based on K-analysis on the content of the volume Mario Pincerle, Fonti archeologiche della magia, edizioni Filelpo, 1967. And Giambattista Calegari's radionics confirmed, 6,000 years later, the transcendent truths of Fo Hi, the discovery of the K effect or radionic effect and the radionic principle, 1938 to 1945, together with the results of continuous and intensive experimentation, confirm that as a result of the cosmogeophysical conjuncture, that is, the contemporaneity of natural phenomena involving the earth and the cosmos of which it is a part, particular processes of natural ionization of space occur, allowing the activation of the phenomenon of resonance, that is, in unimpeded, i.e., more transparent space, the exchange of energy between radio oscillating emitting structures, in our case planets, stars, constellations, and humans becomes possible. This phenomenon affects all living beings, therefore in addition to humans also animals and plants, as well as inorganic matter. This results in the manifestation, in that sky and at that time, of phenomena and events that interfere and interact with man's earthly day, both on the material and on the psychic and emotional levels. According to the results of Calegari's experiments, man is nothing more than a particular natural oscillating circuit, according to Calegari, equipped with an antenna for picking up waves coming from the space in which he's immersed. In this natural circuit, the coil is made up of the nerve filaments that branch off from the spinal axis, while the capacitor is made up of the masses spread throughout the body. The average value of the radionic frequency of humans, according to the original Calegari scale, is FK 5.751, not hertz. But if desired, the value could be calculated, which is the result of two frequencies, FK Sirius 3.753 biophysical wave and FK Sirius 9.1 photopsychic wave. There's much to say about the radiation coming from celestial bodies, colors and musical notes correspond to wavelength and frequency. After all, the cosmic configuration and balance of our solar system are governed by a musical order. For example, our Earth colors in blue and sound is in G. Giambattista Caligari has determined the radionic values of the energy of the sun, stars, galaxies, and comets. FK Shirgos 8001 of interstellar, interplanetary, and endoatomic space, FK 1000, planets, satellites, minor planets, meteors, and sunspots, FK 001. The sun and moon influence humans, making them part of the masculine nature of the former and the feminine nature of the latter. Consider that a red blood cell completes a full circuit of our body, while the heart beats 28 times and we take 7 breaths, with the same ratio between the number of heartbeats and breaths in a minute as between the solar and lunar cycles. This means that the rhythms in humans follow the same laws as the rhythms of our galaxy, i.e., there's a perfect analogy between microcosm and macrocosm. As if that were not enough, everything is complicated and enhanced, astonishing us by the almost nagging presence of certain numbers, both in nature and in the universe, and in works, artistic and otherwise, created by man, such as the golden or divine number, or Fibonacci number 1.2618. We find it in the arrangement of leaves on plants, in the logarithmic spirals of sunflowers, shells, vortices in galactic spirals, in the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, Piero della Francesca, Albrecht Dürer, and incidentally, strangely enough, in the radionic value of water found by Caligari, FK 1600, dB 314. This is present in the structure of the Pyramid of Cheops, also known as the Great Pyramid. Caligari found the radionic number FK 3.333, which is also close to twice 1.6 and 18th, which is the value at which images are enhanced, i.e., they appear in natural relief, so much so that if a ray of light is passed through a Caligari radionic circuit, which forms a radionic channel, variations occur in Fraunhofer's black lines. Time does not allow us to explore these topics in depth here. With the Caligari Central Radio-Biological CRC that you see on this table, it is the prototype of the new model called CRC 75 Power 5 Super Original New, produced exclusively by the Caligari Radionics and Radiobiology Laboratory, which I direct and coordinate and which I am officially presenting today. It is possible to pick up matter in general, and therefore in particular human beings. That is, it is possible even through photographs to enter into radionic resonance with the object or subject and study its energy state at that moment, excesses, deficits, balance. Once the imbalances have been identified and the causes of these imbalances found, it is then possible to activate procedures to rebalance, in order to try to restore isoenergism in the individual under examination. It is precisely from the table of this 12th VICO Conference on Astrology that I announce the birth of radionic astrology, for which a new Caligari radionics instrument is currently being developed. The first radionic astrology center, called PC05 Astral Radionic Caligari, a unique and elective device for astrological applications. It allows radionic verification by means of hologram technology of the determination specific to astrological techniques. This makes it possible to ascertain the current state of resonance, or lack thereof, between the subject and the result of the astrological calculation, reported in graphic form. If there is no resonance, it will be necessary to identify the basic data that is not real, for example, the complete coordinates of the subject's birth, day, month, year, time, place, environmental conditions, local and/or general events of significant importance, etc., and then make the necessary corrections to remodel the astrological determination. If there is resonance, the complementary radionic frequency FKC or FKER can be determined in order to intervene positively, applying the K method, Caligari radionic method, to the subject's energy state in a natural way, using subtle energies that are neither destructive nor invasive, have no side effects, and are never harmful. In other words, it will be possible to verify whether the astrological remedy recommended by the operating protocol is actually necessary and applicable or not compatible with the subject themselves. For this verification, it will be necessary to calculate with the aforementioned PC05 Caligari the value of the radionic frequency A of the expected astrological remedy and check with the same instrument whether or not this frequency is complementary for the subject. For example, if the astrological remedy is a geographical environmental shift, change of both spatial terrestrial and energetic magnetic coordinates, the radionic frequency of the recommended site is determined with reference to a time interval close to the expected one, and it is checked whether this frequency is complementary, i.e., whether it is the one necessary for the overall rebalancing of the subject. If this is not the case, the proposed case must be re-examined and a different astrological remedy found, which could be replaced by the direct and unique application of the complementary radionic frequency FKC mentioned above, using the aforementioned CRC 7505. In closing my speech, I do not want to take up any more time from the proceedings of this table. Allow me to offer my heartfelt applause and sincere thanks to Ciro Discepolo, who, with his usual elegance and passion, has courageously recounted to you all, with affectionate detail, some of his direct radionic experiences with my father, Giambattista Caligari. I'm deeply grateful to him. Astrology, Prejudices, and a Gem about Marconi by Emilio del Giudice. 6. Let me start with Shakespeare, when he has Hamlet say, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Philosophy doesn't have much to do with it, but give me 5 minutes, and I will remind you in a biased way how the radio was invented at the end of the 19th century. Around 1870, an English theorist named Maxwell demonstrated that, according to the equations of electromagnetism, it was possible for the energy of the field to propagate through space via electromagnetic waves, which do not coincide with electric and magnetic fields, but are, so to speak, their traveling component. In other words, the overall field has this traveling component and then has the component that in English is called the near field and in Italian is called the campo vicinale, which propagates much less and is the field close to the source. How the idea came about: as long as everything is static, nothing propagates, but suppose someone close to the source of the field modifies the source. Since this field acts at a distance and on electric charges, the question arises, how long after the source is modified does the charge receiving the action notice that something has changed? Does it notice instantly or after a while? Let's simplify it. Imagine you have a pool full of water. Suppose there is a ball floating on the water. You are a little way away from the ball and you want to move it. So you start hitting the water with an oar, causing waves that travel and move the ball. If you aim the strokes well, you can move it. This is an example in which you modify an infinite medium, and the effect at a distance is perceived after a while. And what is the medium? It is a wave that propagates Well, the electromagnetic wave follows this idea to some extent, i.e., you basically have a field that I generate here where there is a charge and it acts there. So I take this charge and instead of keeping it still, I move it, and as a result, the force that acts also fluctuates. But does the fluctuation appear simultaneously or after a while? Well, the answer given by Maxwell's theory is that it happens after a while, and that the speed at which this wave propagates in terms of the parameters of the theory is equal to the speed of light. This leads to the suspicion that light is a particular form of the electromagnetic field. After 30 years, this all seemed like a theoretical construct. The German Hertz, who was assisted in his research by an Italian named Augusto Righi, after whom squares, streets, high schools, etc. are named, and whom we can therefore define as a validated person, so to speak, experimentally verified Maxwell's theories. So, using electromagnetic waves, it is possible to send messages over long distances. Why did it take a number of years before the practical applications of electromagnetic waves came into play? Because one of the consequences of the theory confirmed by the experiment was that electromagnetic waves propagated in a straight line with lateral fluctuations, the so-called refractive effects, which, however, were of the order of magnitude of the wavelength. Therefore, given the antennas available at the time, if one used electromagnetic waves with a wavelength of a few hundred meters to a kilometer, the refractive effects allowed these waves to cross a hill, but certainly not the curvature of the Earth. Therefore, the idea of transmitting an electromagnetic wave from Europe to America or vice versa was considered nonsense. Fortunately, this nonsense was attempted by Guglielmo Marconi, who was the son of a very wealthy family. His father was a rich landowner in Bologna, and his mother, who was English, was even richer. So he came from a very wealthy family, and as a daddy's boy, he had all the arrogance of children from upper-class families. He decided to give it a try. He was certainly intelligent, but also ignorant. He didn't study because he was rich. Confusing the electromagnetic field with the electric field, he thought, here in the books it says that the electric field near a conductor is a parallel to the surface of the conductor. Therefore, the Earth is a conductor and the electric field will be parallel to the Earth. So the curvature of the Earth is not a problem. He was right, or rather wrong, because he was ignorant of the fact that the electric field that is parallel is the vicinal field and not the electromagnetic field, which is something else. All right, so he knocked on the door of Augusto Righi, who in the meantime had a professorship in Milan. Certainly, if Hertz was the father of electromagnetic waves, he was the uncle. Marconi knocked on his door and said, "Professor, I have thought of a way to transmit a radio signal from Europe to America." And Righi, who had the arrogance of the accomplished scientist, replied, "Oh, really? And how would that work?" And Marconi explained to him what I illustrated to you a moment ago. Then Righi, with an icy air, said to him, "Get out of here immediately. Don't waste me time. Study first and then come back here." And he threw him out. Marconi, who fortunately did not have to ask for funds from the CNR, which would certainly not have given them to him, asked his mother instead, who, faced with a possible negative opinion from Righi, would have gouged out his eyes, Righi's. So his mother financed the venture, and he left for England, set up an antenna in Cornwall, and then, since his mother's money was considerable but not infinite, in Newfoundland, St. John's, Newfoundland, Vichenmula, Canada, he rented some land. He didn't buy it, and set up another antenna. Meanwhile, newspapers began to publish the news that a young Italian was preparing a wireless telegraph from Europe to America. So journalists began interviewing various scientists on the subject, and Le Monde, the largest French newspaper of the time, published a front-page interview with the leading French theoretical physicist Henri Poincaré, a great scientist. In short, all the people I am mentioning were not stupid or ignorant. They were not Piero Angela. Each of them had discovered things. So, Henri Poincaré writes with all his French pomposity, but has no one explained to this Italian that the earth is round? Or perhaps he thinks that the earth is flat, as the ancients were mistakenly believed to think, but they haven't explained it to him. This is similar in a way to the story of the bumblebee that cannot fly and does not know it and flies anyway. C. The Fundamentals of Medical Astrology by Ciro Discepolo, Armenia, ed. Marconi is not interested in the matter. The big day arrives. He sends the signal, and the signal arrives. What a figure! So if we were to take that other pompous windbag Popper seriously, we would have to say, but then, has the theory of electromagnetism been falsified? Because the theory says that electromagnetic waves propagate approximately in a straight line. But on the other hand, the Earth is round. So putting the two things together, considering an electromagnetic wave that starts in America, it cannot reach Europe. If it does reach us, then, according to Popper, one of the two statements has been falsified. So that means that either it is not true that electromagnetic waves travel in a straight line, or it is not true that the Earth is round. But since it is absolutely true that electromagnetic waves propagate in a straight line, and it is equally true that the Earth is round, and now we even have photographs, then what is the explanation? The explanation is always that there is something that is not known at the time of discussion, and that misleads people. In this specific case, it is the ionosphere. At that time, neither Righi nor Marconi knew that the ionosphere existed, an atmospheric layer located several tens of kilometers above the ground, and composed of ionized gases because radiation from space ionizes the gases in the upper atmosphere, forming a layer of ionized molecules. This layer acts as a mirror for electromagnetic waves that have a wavelength that, so to speak, corresponds to the density of this plasma. Therefore, for frequencies lower than the so-called plasma frequency of the gas, the ionosphere acts as a mirror, i.e., that layer of gas is opaque to radiation. So, fortunately, fortune favors the bold. The frequencies used by Marconi fell within the right range. So Marconi's wave started from Newfoundland, traveled in a straight line, rose, met the mirror, was reflected back to Earth, and thus managed to reach Europe. So, as you can see, Righi's theory was absolutely correct. Poincaré's arguments were sacrosanct, and yet Marconi was right. Why? Because another circumstance unknown to his contemporaries had intervened, which adjusted everything. In fact, there is a saying, if an old professor says that something is not possible, he is almost certainly wrong, while if he says that it is possible, he's almost certainly right. That is to say that something is not possible is the biggest nonsense one can say, because there's always a way around the issue. So, I'm not claiming that the hypothesis I sold you earlier is the right one. It may be different, but it shows you that it's not impossible to think of mechanisms that account for it. If you think about it more intensely, the thing that is certainly not possible is to say it's not possible Just to say that ignorance does not always help. The first time Marconi did well. The next time he did badly, very badly, and this was the case with radar, the first idea for which came from Marconi again. In fact, in a lecture he gave to the Navy General Staff in 1922, Marconi proposed using an electromagnetic wave that is fired from an antenna located on a ship, travels, and if it encounters another ship, bounces back, revealing its presence. This is the principle of radar, except that Marconi, as we have seen, confused fields with electromagnetic fields and did not have a clear understanding of the concept of wavelength. Studying is not always useless. Sometimes it is useful. He who was fond of long waves designed, or had designed, a radar based on a radio wave several hundred meters long. So the fact that the Italian Navy did not have radar during the war is false. It did have it, and the Italians called it gufo, owl, but it was useless because the electromagnetic wave used had a wavelength of several hundred meters, and ships are shorter than that. The refractive effect, i.e. the lateral deviation, completely covered the ship, with the result that nothing could be seen. In fact, the resolution power of a radar, i.e. the size of the smallest visible object, is given by the wavelength used. Therefore, since ships were smaller than the wavelength used, the owl proved to be a fiasco. 2 of these devices were installed, one on the battleship Littorio and one on the destroyer Lindsay, but after a few months they were dismantled because nothing could be seen. The British, on the other hand, used electromagnetic waves with a wavelength of 10 centimeters for their radar, and in this way they were able to see not only ships, but also airplanes. So, even though Marconi came up with the idea for radar, thanks to the fact that he was not very familiar with the consequence of wave theories, the device he designed proved ineffective. So, coming to our astrology and to many other phenomena, not just astrology, I would say that a whole series of factors that would make the phenomenon plausible are commonly not considered but rather neglected. And in fact, in recent years, you have witnessed the flourishing of impossible things, cold fusion, i.e., how it is possible to achieve nuclear reactions at room temperature without great means. Then we learn, and it is true, that the armed forces of a number of countries are adopting strange weapons called depleted uranium weapons, even though depleted uranium has nothing to do with it. It is just a way to mislead. Weapons that produce a flood of neutrons, a flood of nuclear reactions in an unconventional way, so to speak. And this is done by the armies of major countries such as the United States, which makes me suspect, among other things, that the hostility shown towards new discoveries is actually a desire inspired by the military not to focus too much attention on the subject so that this discovery remains a monopoly. Okay, I haven't talked about astrology, but I have talked about conditioning, prejudices, and the reasons why scientists or the scientific community do not always deserve to be listened to. Sometimes they even deserve to be ignored. The Miraculous Water That Heals by Nicola del Giudice, 7. I'm going to stray a little from the topic discussed so far, because as a homeopathic doctor I encounter paradoxical aspects. Miraculous water that heals, the absence of molecules as a conditio sine qua non of a therapeutic phenomenon that cannot be explained by science, and therefore I refer more to the actions and events that occur within my domain. Of course, there have been many strange phenomena in science, which was once the preserve of magicians and charlatans, but today forms the basis of science. Another interesting phenomenon is cold fusion. Ciro and I have known each other since we were kids, so we have often talked about the various things that happen, and certainly one of the most important qualities for a researcher should be curiosity. That is, not to deny a phenomenon a priori, nor to seek a scientific explanation at all costs. I have seen many theories that have fallen in the face of empirical evidence, but I have never seen empirical evidence that has fallen because of a theory. And so we accept empirical evidence without having to resort, as we sometimes see, to denying the evidence or to self-censorship, so to speak, in order not to devalue the physical theory. And that is precisely what happened recently. A patient came to me who was suffering from a disease. She had discovered a very serious disease, multiple sclerosis, and as often happens, this disease had broken out after pregnancy, that is, a month after pregnancy in the lower part of her body, and the patient was desperate. We'd known each other for some time, and she told me that she had gone to a famous center in Milan for the diagnosis. This person, naturally very attached to homeopathic medicine, had quite a lot of undeserved confidence in me, and asked what she could do given that it was not possible to treat the disease with traditional medicine. So we subjected her to a 6-month treatment of special magnetic fields, and at the end of this treatment she returned to Milan, to the center where she had been diagnosed with the disease, and after undergoing an MRI she was told that the lesions had completely disappeared, and that she had regained movement and sensitivity. It was perhaps a special case compared to many others because it happened recently, but the fact was clear. I remember that we were at the first magnetic field session, and I tried to test the sensitivity on her foot with a needle and saw that there was absolutely none. After a few treatments, I repeated the same test, and the woman reacted immediately to the stimulus, which meant that she had regained sensitivity. When, after the magnetic field treatment, she returned to that center in Milan, the person who had diagnosed her illness, who was also a dear friend of hers, unable to deny the evidence but trying not to undermine traditional medicine and theory, told her that he had misdiagnosed her and that it was not multiple sclerosis. In other words, he preferred to look like a fool rather than admit the benefits that homeopathic treatment had brought to the woman. There are many such cases, but there are also cases of mutual irradiation with our neighbors, the people we meet, and these exchanges can also have a therapeutic function. It may be the guru or Jesus Christ who heals the crippled. It may be a healer who heals a headache or whatever. However we radiate, we can also have practical proof of this. In fact, if you take a Hertzian camera to photograph a patient and his therapist, you can see that the photographs of their auras taken before and after treatment are different. Paradoxically, the therapist's aura after treatment tends to take on the characteristics of the patients as if he, the therapist, were undergoing the negative influence of the patient, as if there were a resonance. This is another astonishing fact that should be analyzed. And of course, official science deprives itself of the opportunity to address these issues, even if, let's be honest, when problems affect their personal lives, they do not hesitate to turn to homeopathy, crowding into clinics, even if secretly, as happened in the past, to a famous Neapolitan pharmacologist who pontificated against homeopathy during his lectures. One day a student went to see a homeopathic doctor, and upon entering coincidentally recognized his pharmacology professor and asked him, Professor, but how come you always spoke badly of homeopathy? Why are you coming to this very office now? The professor looked at him and replied, my son, bread is bread, but skin is skin. Another case occurred with Professor Garatini when there was a debate between allopathic medicine and homeopathic medicine. The allopaths spoke first, and I won't tell you what they started saying about us homeopaths, that we were frauds, magicians, charlatans, and so on and so forth. But Garatini in particular ironically pointed out that, of course, there was no explanation as to how molecules recognized each other within an organism, because the strange thing is that it is taken for granted tautologically that molecules move, but that is a view that molecules move. It is know-how. But why does know-how work? How do molecules recognize each other among the millions of molecules inside an organism? How do they know which is their soulmate with which to interlock and give rise to the oncological effect? They don't explain this. And of course, we had no answer to the question. So I said to him, look, Professor, I am willing to walk around Naples with a sign in front of me saying, homeopathy is stupid and I'm an imbecile, if you give me an explanation of how molecules move. Then he said to me, are you trying to take the piss out of me? I replied, no, I didn't say that. Actually, listen, I replied, let's imagine, and let's knock on wood, that you take a plane to attend a conference in the United States, open the newspaper, and see a small article, let's keep knocking on wood, saying that Professor so-and-so died in a car accident. At that point, you put your hand on your heart and fall to the ground because you've had a heart attack. So, Professor Garatini, can you explain to me what molecule entered your eye from the newspaper? And from your eye it went to the medulla of the adrenal gland, where it activated the production of adrenaline, which entered the bloodstream, causing vasoconstriction, and you had a heart attack. Can you explain it to me, Dr. Garatini? Of course, I didn't get an answer, so I'll answer myself. Here's a clear example. Let's take two people suffering from the same condition who go to two different homeopathic doctors. Both are well versed in homeopathic medicine and prescribe the correct treatment, which is the same for both, but one recovers and the other does not. Can you explain why one recovers and the other does not? Because homeopathy recognizes an effect that is the effect of the therapist's medicine. The therapist is also a drug, and a powerful one at that, so the same drug that has no effect in one doctor has an effect in another doctor, because it is associated with this resonant exchange of radiation, which is naturally the primary source of healing. This happened, for example, to a patient suffering from asthma, who entered the waiting room breathing heavily and sat down. While waiting, he started chatting with the people who were there in the office, and when his turn came and he entered, he told me that the crisis had passed. In other words, discovering the possibility of opening up and exchanging information, and therefore also important feelings, sensations, and emotions, within the office had caused his body to relax without the need for cortisone or other drugs. So, we learn, and in conclusion, we try to use homeopathy to enhance those seemingly strange aspects that this science proposes, which are the same ones we find in astrology and acupuncture. That is a sort of behind-the-scenes view of official science, a sort of mind that also explains the great discoveries made by official science, because perhaps it has not been possible to demonstrate, for example, how molecules meet, but the fact that molecules meet is a real fact. So, If we can re-evaluate this meeting, it is naturally a big step forward for science, and diseases will no longer need the type of drugs we use today. Thank you. Loud applause. Ed. A Scientist's Thoughts on Astrology by Renato Palmieri. Sirius rises, a leaf moves on my balcony. Of course, it does not move only because of the influence of Sirius, but because of the infinite magnetogravitational components that coincide with the rising of Sirius. These change from moment to moment in an undetectable way, and therefore the leaf trembles with every breath of wind and rustles with all the other leaves. However, if it is true that it is impossible to separate the countless influences of the astronomical firmament from one another, the cyclical nature of many of them in relation to the position of the Earth with respect to the solar system and Dante's other stars, can determine significant periodic variations in the quantity and nature of those influences and thus contribute to imprinting different characteristics on those born under the light on their birthday. This is what someone like myself, who is not a scholar of astrology but knows from history that this discipline counts among its followers illustrious names of thinkers and scientists, can recognize in astrology. Furthermore, I do not exclude out of prejudice the symbolic and supersensible value of astral references in human experience. Homo sum, humani nihil a me alienum puto, in the words of Terence. The fact remains that, however it may be, and as has been amply demonstrated elsewhere, academic science, in terms of true knowledge, is as qualified as the crudest of astrologers, precisely on those subjects such as gravitation and electromagnetism, whose nature it essentially ignores, and which it adduces with such confidence to refute the abhorred heresy of astrology. A few comments by Ciro Discepolo, two more writings by non-aligned, open-minded scientists who study phenomena that are apparently paranormal, but are only paranormal in the sense that they are not accepted in the establishment. We sincerely thank Professors Vincenzo Di Napoli and Renato Palmieri for the distilled knowledge and wisdom they give us every time they agree to collaborate with our magazine. Over the past year, we have published their writings, which I believe to be of truly extraordinary interest, as well as other writings of similar content. I'm referring to several articles and short essays by scientists that have made us reflect on some unique topics, which I would like to summarize here. Engineer and Professor Di Napoli, together with engineer Caligari and other scholars of the method of the great Giambattista Caligari, have taught us, among other things, that when two bodies in space are in resonance, their energies, the impedance in the transmission between the two energies is zero, which means that distance no longer has any value. The significance of this truth is immeasurable because it explains, among other things, how Pluto can have the same value from an astrological point of view as the Moon or Mars. Professor Palmieri pointed out to us how modern physics takes no account of the question of the polarity of the gravitational field of the Earth and other celestial bodies. Furthermore, in his unigravitational physics, he unifies the nature of electromagnetic and gravitational waves, making fundamental distinctions where almost all physicists of all times become confused and assert, for example, that Pluto cannot act on human beings because its gravitational force is almost zero. The two researchers and scientists, Emilio and Nicola del Giudice, have clarified with many clear details the discussion on water memory and the fact that a child, as soon as it is born, before creating his own personal magnetic field, takes on what gravitates towards it at the moment of birth. Water molecules are oriented by the magnetic field and retain this orientation forever, which can greatly help to explain how astrology works. But our friends have written about these and much more on these pages. Remember this because, in my opinion, Ricerca 90 has been able to seal an important chapter of history in the great book of the philosophy of science. Ciro Discepolo, I apologize for the excessive simplifications necessary, perhaps for a non-specialist audience. As you can easily understand, we are truly facing a topical stage in relation to the heuristic path in general and that of the study of astrology in particular. The three concepts I have just brought to your attention could be the basis for a universal theory that we could call the Calegari-Palmieri del Giudice theory, both sufficient to explain a possible functioning of astrology from a purely physical point of view, without the need to resort to Jung's synchronicity or even to the so-called paranormal phenomena that so delight the minds of the exponents of CIKP. And if you will allow me, I would like to add my name to this theory, given the contribution I believe I have made personally to this general theory of how astrology works through what I have written, including in this volume about why I think solar, lunar, and terrestrial revolutions work so well. Lunar and terrestrial revolutions work so well through that refresh that occurs when a cycle, any cycle, circadian, monthly, annual, returns to the gamma point of its expressive curve in the following pages. Obviously, I do not believe that the subject can be considered exhausted, but I think that compared to just the day before the 12th Conference of Astrological Studies in Vico Equense, a new and very important Weltanschauung is coming to the attention of the world and above all of open-minded people. We will need to return to this many times in the future and study and discuss it, but for now, given the topic covered in this volume, we can conclude this discussion and say something even more specific about solar and lunar revolutions. About 50 years ago, the scientific study of biorhythms gained ground among doctors. 8. In fact, even after the end of World War II, doctors continued to administer drugs to patients without attaching particular importance to the time of day when this was done. 9. Thus, for example, vitamin and mineral supplements were prescribed for the evening before bedtime, or more recently, melatonin was administered in the morning. When doctors discovered the importance of biorhythms, many such mistakes were no longer made. Today we know that there are several biorhythms, the most important of which are 3, 10, 1, a circadian rhythm, which, as the word suggests, lasts about a day and is obviously related to the time it takes for the Earth to rotate on its axis. We have a great deal of evidence of this biorhythm in relation to the life of humans, animals, and plants. In humans, for example, it is easy to demonstrate that there is a precise reproducibility of the peaks indicated in the curve of certain biological functions observed throughout the day, such as the frequency of daily peaks in urination, blood pressure, blood flocculation index, and so on. For example, returning to melatonin, we know that our body produces it continuously, but with a peak of overproduction about half an hour after sunset. This is because, among other things, melatonin has an antidepressant effect, which is very important when the sun no longer illuminates our day and also predisposes us to sleep. From this, you can understand how wrong it was for some doctors to administer artificial melatonin early in the morning. I would like to mention incidentally that the poor Professor D. Bella, who was vilified by the medical establishment because he opposed the interests of pharmaceutical companies, believed it was very useful, like other alternative scientists, to administer industrial doses of melatonin and vitamin C to both sick and healthy people. It is for statements like this that I earn myself the stake, as in the shameful episode of Wikipedia Italia. See the website http://www.cirodiscepolo.t Wikipedia HTM. You should not be surprised, therefore, if one day some sympathizer of CICP or Wikipedia Italia manages to find cocaine in my desk in order to get rid of such an inconvenient and unpleasant character. 2. A monthly rhythm of about 29 days, clearly related to the complete passage of the moon around the Earth. Despite the contrary opinion of scientists, and with evidence that even children can see, we have incontrovertible proof of this, such as the tides or the menstrual cycle. 3. An annual rhythm linked to the complete revolution of the Earth around the Sun. Animals hibernate at the same time every year, migrate or are driven by sexual desire at a specific time of year. Trees bear fruit at the same time every year, and the list goes on. Now take a look at the sine wave below, and pay particular attention to the alpha point, the beginning of the sine wave. This sine wave can illustrate the pattern of any biorhythm, but let's consider two in particular. The one that could graph the pattern of the lunar biorhythm and the solar biorhythm. Let's start with the latter. The moment we are born, with our first breath, our first annual biorhythm begins, starting at point alpha and ending at point alpha. So we should not be surprised if someone, the author Hideki, asserts that at the moment of the annual solar return, precisely at point alpha, the imprinting we receive from the sky is not the same as that of all the other days of the year, but is very special, not because of analogies, but because the alpha moment is the reset, the zeroing of an entire annual cycle to move on to another annual cycle. This, in my opinion, amply justifies the importance of each of us finding ourselves at that moment and not at any other, under that particular sky of the world, according to criteria whose true literature, in the sense of arising from practice and not from theory, suggests that our year can thus be improved but also worsened. The same argument, it seems quite obvious to me, applies to the sine wave of the monthly cycle, where the alpha point corresponds to the return of the moon to its precise point of birth in relation to the subject under consideration. And obviously the same applies to Earth revolutions. Well, I believe that this explanation is plausible and leaves scholars, students, colleagues and detractors free to use or not use this wonderful tool for improving the quality of our lives, which is in fact targeted solar revolutions and targeted lunar revolutions. Notes 1. Carl Gustav Jung, Synchronicity, publisher Boringhieri, Seppier, Turin, 1980, 124 pages. 2. Gret Baumann Jung, Some Reflections on Carl Gustav Jung's Horoscope, Ricerca 90, number 5, January 1991. 3. Renato Palmieri, an excellent Neapolitan physicist. The author had the small merit of suggesting to the Italian Institute of Philosophical Studies, a wonderful institution of knowledge founded and directed by Gerardo Marotta, to publish Professor Palmieri's invaluable volume, which otherwise would have risked never seeing the light of day. It was not necessary to push in this sense because my interlocutors, both Professor Antonio Gargano, Secretary General of the Institute, and my dear friend Professor Aldo Tonini, immediately accepted my request and added another gold link to their already immense chain of cultural works. The book La fisica unigravitazionale e l'equazione cosmologica, Unigravitational Physics and the Cosmological Equation, is finally a reality today, and is certainly one of the things I am most proud of in my life. 4. Engineer Vincenzo di Napoli, who passed away in the winter of 2007, was a great researcher whose life crossed paths with mine several times. He was my electronics professor at the Augusto Righi Institute in Naples, a simple professor who got to the heart of the matter and whose lessons were understood by everyone immediately. I later met him again as president of the Neapolitan Radio Amateurs Association when I tried to get my license without success because at the time there was a difficult radio telegraphy exam to pass and my non-musical ear made it very difficult for me to distinguish the dot from the line. Later still, I met him as president of the Calegari Study Center in connection with Calegari Radiobiology. I wrote briefly about this in my book L'interpretazione del tema natale, The Interpretation of the Natal Chart. Armenia Publisher, Milan, 2007, pages 350 on pages 87. Finally, I would like to add, and I do not think it is a coincidence, that Professor Di Napoli has always lived less than 50 meters from my home. I remember him with affection and gratitude. 5. Engineer Giuseppe Calegari is the son of the great Giovan Battista Calegari, about whom I write briefly in the book L'interpretazione del tema natale, o pelo nei CT, on pages 90. To my delight, Engineer Calegari is trying to carry on his father's great discoveries. 6. Professor of Physics at the Higher Institute of Physics in Milan. Together with Dr. Nicola Del Giudice, his brother and homeopathic doctor, he has written books of great scientific interest and has carried on with great effectiveness, in my opinion, Eddie, the discussion on the memory of water, a topic of extraordinary interest for understanding the mechanisms of the influence of the sky on the lives of earthly creatures. 7. The same notes regarding his work in partnership with his physicist brother in Milan also apply to him. Nicola Del Giudice is a well-known and highly regarded homeopathic doctor, endocrinologist, and researcher in the broadest sense. We recall his and his brother's book Omeopatia e Bioenergetica, Le medicine alternative, dalla stregoneria alla scienza, Homeopathy and Bioenergetics, Alternative Medicine from Witchcraft to Science, Cortina Publisher, Verona 1999, 300 pages, and also the book Omeopataia, un ponte tra biologia e psicologia, 20 anni di ricerca della Fondazione Omeopatica Italiana, Homeopathy, a bridge between biology and psychology, 20 years of research by the Italian Homeopathic Foundation, Nuova Ipsa, Palermo, 1998, 3 pages. 8. Lyle Watson, Supernatura Rizzoli, Editore, Milan, 1974. 9. Ibid, Paola Cannatello. In addition to being very amused by Marconi's unprejudiced ignorance, which brought him much joy and some pain, and which once again demonstrates how science sometimes clings to the knowledge it has, without assuming that new knowledge may arrive to overturn all certainty. I must tell you that I found these contributions extremely interesting. So fascinating that I got a little lost. I clearly understood how they are all linked to the possibility of providing an explanation of how astrology works, but can you help me put them together to use them in this direction? Ciro Discepolo, I'll try, but we need to take some important steps back and open up some broader parentheses. Fortunately, we don't have to obey the directives of an external editor, so we can attempt to do this with a certain degree of peace of mind. Let's start with a brief discussion of luck. I consider myself lucky in terms of work, having been born with Jupiter in the 6th house and conjunct the moon with good aspects to Saturn and Pluto. Definitely, even though in other areas of my life I've been very unlucky and very penalized by fate. However, I am convinced that we must take the whole package when it is given to us at birth. We must not dwell on the alleged misfortunes that have been unfairly inflicted upon us. So I'm lucky in my work. And, in my opinion, it is no coincidence, absolutely no coincidence, that in the course of my life I have had what I would dare to call an almost magical encounter in space and time with extraordinary figures of knowledge. If we consider the 1,000 variables of space, Naples, and the environments where I moved most, and time in the span of, let's say, the history of the learned man, the man who began to leave written evidence of his passage, therefore, in the last 5,000 years. If we consider the years in which I have lived or am living, and the somewhat limited, even very limited, space of Naples and its surroundings, the fact that I have physically met extraordinary figures of knowledge is, in my opinion, a matter of great fortune. Figures such as Giovan Battista Caligari and others whom we will now revisit. Returning to the subject of Renato Palmieri, the engineer Vincenzo di Napoli, the two brothers, the physicist Emilio del Giudice, and the homeopathic doctor Nicola del Giudice, and the engineer Caligari himself, son, who is continuing the work of this wonderful contemporary figure of ours. Here, the first thing I would like to point out is that at that brilliant conference we had in Vico Equensi, which I mentioned earlier, at that exceptional round table where we exchange views in front of a very interested audience, myself and Professor Caligari's son, Emilio del Giudice, Nicola del Giudice, Renato Palmieri, and engineer Vincenzo di Napoli, unfortunately several of them are no longer with us. Well, I believe that the foundations were laid there for the scholars who will come after us and who will have to complete this work. Foundations which, in my view, laid the groundwork for explaining how astrology works. Of course, I don't have the unrealistic ambition to challenge contemporary scientists and throw these truths in their faces. They would make mincemeat of me and have an easy time of it because they have the establishment on their side, first and foremost. And then I would not be the right person to dialogue with them or duel with them on the level of physics, theoretical physics above all. However, I am convinced that it will be physicists who will soon be able to offer us precise paradigms with which to measure the things we are talking about. Therefore, I am not concerned from the point of view of dialectical challenges and possible new duels, which do not appeal to me that much. No, I want to establish that for readers interested in the subject, the basics have now been written, but they will have to be better formulated and better amalgamated. The interaction of each of them with the others will have to be explained in greater detail. However, the material is there and it is abundant. And I would start from that first great truth that I learned from the great Professor Giovan Battista Caligari, who, at the dawn of my studies in astrology, revealed this very important truth to me, which then became a beacon that guided me for all the following decades. He pointed out to me, not in theory, but by showing me the effects that can be seen with my own eyes through his extraordinary Caligari control unit, that in the so-called empty space, which is not really empty but which we consider empty, for example interplanetary space, the impedance must be considered zero. And what is the effect of zero impedance? That distance no longer has any value. This very simple rule, this very simple enormous truth, can explain almost everything on its own, because it tells us, for example, why Pluto, which is so small and so far from the Sun, can act in the same way as the Moon, which is just a few arms' lengths away from us. This is a first great truth that we must absolutely reflect on. Then there is that other very important truth that calls into question, immediately after or alongside Caligari's truth, Newton's law of gravitation. And here we must necessarily open another parenthesis. In fact, scientists might immediately object, yes, but we already knew that, because Newton's law of gravitation has been superseded by Einstein's law of relativity and energy propagation, which has, so to speak, enriched it. Because let's be clear, it's not that Newton's law of gravitation no longer works. Newton's law of gravitation continues to work within certain parameters, i.e., when we are not traveling at close to the speed of light. So I would like to remind you that in order to prove the law of energy propagation in the universe, so wonderfully written by Albert Einstein, one of his German scientist colleagues went, at the beginning of the last century, to seek practical, scientific, and clear proof of what he had theorized. The scientist was Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington, a British astronomer. Eddington organized an expedition to Principe, an island in Sao Tome and Principe, West Africa, to photograph the total solar eclipse of May 29, 1919. During these observations, Eddington verified Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity, which predicted that light from distant stars would be deflected as it passed near the Sun. The photographs of the eclipse confirmed this prediction, showing that the apparent position of the stars had changed due to the curvature of space-time caused by the Sun's mass. This discovery was fundamental in confirming Einstein's theory of general relativity. So let's go back to Newton. We said that as long as we are not in extreme conditions such as the speed of light, Newton's laws of gravitation apply. However, Newton's laws of gravitation would say that since the mass of the outermost planet in our solar system is too small and its distance is too great, the distance between Pluto and Earth, Pluto's energy is zero, and Pluto would not even exist as a planet. You know about this classification according to which a committee of experts occasionally kicks Pluto out of the planetary system and then perhaps lets it back in. I don't know what the situation is today, but it is the experts who decide the ed. Well, this enormous truth that Caligari has shown us immediately invalidates, falsifies, to use Popper's language, Newton's law of gravitation, because it tells us that Pluto acts exactly like Jupiter, which is many times larger and much closer than Pluto to Earth and the Sun. So this is a first parameter that will allow tomorrow's physicists to rewrite the general equations of physics to explain how astrology works. Then there is another very important step, which Renato Palmiri revealed to us with a trivial example during the experiment he performed in front of us at the Vico Equense conference. By bringing the two pieces of the chessboard closer together, the king and queen, which have a magnet underneath to be attracted to the chessboard, practically have the same polarity, and when he brought them closer together, he demonstrated that the repulsion did not occur along the axis, but along a cone, or in any case a circular shape rather than a straight line. He said that the chapter on the polarity of the North Pole and South Pole needs to be completely rewritten, because this polarity is probably not fixed, but changes and is not the same for every celestial body. So you can see that this in turn falsifies Newton's law of gravitation as we know it, and therefore opens up huge gaps in the system. But it also opens up equally important gaps in our understanding of how astrology works. The same can be said for the studies carried out by Engineer Di Napoli, who was a highly skilled operator of the Caligari control unit, and therefore possessing this jewel of technology, science, and knowledge, that is the Caligari control unit. He was able to produce a whole series of experiments, including one on the Pyramid of Cheops, for which he was able to demonstrate the ancient Egyptians' skillful use of frequencies. I'm referring to when he talks about that frequency which we could call stalling, more or less in the orange part of the visible spectrum, used by the Egyptians for a very specific purpose: to harness the energy of insects and biological microorganisms so that the pharaoh's body would not decompose, and also the orientation of the Pyramid of Cheops in relation to the stars at that time, which demonstrated the perfect knowledge that those peoples also had of astrology. This, too, is an important piece in the mosaic we're dealing with. And then, of course, there is the fundamental issue, in my opinion, of the memory of water, which has been pursued for many years by two late and talented scientists, Emilio del Giudice, a Neapolitan physicist who worked at the CNR in Milan and produced physics research in Milan, and Nicola del Giudice, who was a homeopathic doctor. Together, they carried out research on the memory of water, one of the most important realities of contemporary knowledge, in my opinion, but which, not surprisingly, is strongly opposed by so-called official science. Let us not forget in this regard that Luc Montagnier, Nobel Prize winner for medicine for his studies on AIDS, devoted almost all of his last years to the study of water memory. A person of little culture, or worse, a person aligned with a politically motivated view of science, may say that water memory is a falsehood. The memory of water, however, is something very important. So continuing, and I realize that a discussion with all these digressions is difficult to bring together and focus, but as I said at the beginning, I'm trying to offer some ideas, some connections that I have proposed, which the new generations and especially physicists will have to work on. I do not have the expertise of a physicist, and here we will need the expertise of many great physicists, such as Giovan Battista Caligari, or Renato Palmieri, or even Vincenzo Di Napoli, who was not a physicist but a technician, because he was an engineer, yet he knew a great deal about physics. Therefore, let us say that I expect physicists to provide fundamental truths on this subject. It is no coincidence that back in 2005, I wanted at that table, I did everything I could to have at that table, I managed to have. At that table, at the same time, the engineer Giuseppe Caligari, son of Giovan Battista Caligari, Emilio del Giudice, Nicola del Giudice, Vincenzo di Napoli, and Renato Palmieri. It was no coincidence. I put my heart and soul into getting them all there that day, and now I should go and check what favorable stars I had that day to have managed to achieve that result, which was even more interesting thanks to the magnificent way my friend Andrea Rossetti conducted the debate. Here, too, I would like to open a small parenthesis. My friend Andrea Rossetti has unfortunately distanced himself from astrology, presumably because he considers his profession as a high school teacher to be a kind of mission, and therefore does it with an almost sacred fervor, I would say, which prevents him from devoting other energies to other aspects of life. However, our door is always open, and I hope that he will return to the family of astrology as soon as possible to contribute with his intelligence and culture to making this discipline even more beautiful than it already is. So, as I was saying, it was no coincidence that I chose the names I mentioned from a list of 100 possible names. No, I absolutely and strongly wanted these people, because by tying together the threads of these thinkers, I had already drawn in my mind the common thread with which, in my opinion, we could then proceed to draft a theory that starts from these principles and could lead to an exhaustive and scientific explanation of how astrology works. And paradoxically, to achieve this, I started from the last step, not the first. From the last, because, as you know, I have been wondering about this magic of the moment of birth for a lifetime. The moment of birth is truly magical if we consider it from a philosophical point of view. And this is where I clash with many of my colleagues who fight it as if it were the plague. The moment of birth is really a moment, not a phase of our life. It is an instant, a single instant, the instant when the sun or moon return to their birth positions in degrees, minutes, and seconds. So it is a moment, and so I have always asked myself, okay, I understand that this moment is significant, and that if we use it in the ways I have explained in many of my books, this moment can be responsibly positive for the development of a month or a year of our lives. Okay, but I have always wondered how this is possible, given that it lasts only as long as the flapping of a small bird's wings. And here the last step joins the first step, that is, Emilio del Giudice's explanation of how astrology works. So let's go back to homeopathic medicine for a moment. I would like to remind you how homeopathic medicine works. Samuel Hahnemann discovered that workers on quinine plantations suffered from diseases similar to typhoid fever, and at that time quinine was used to treat typhoid fever. He made this connection, and from there came up with the famous motto of homeopathic medicine, similia similibus curantur, like cures like, which is also the principle behind vaccines. If I inject a healthy individual with the dead smallpox virus, that healthy individual's immune system will be prepared to fight that virus. Then, when the live smallpox virus actually enters their body, rather than the dead virus, the body will be able to neutralize it. This is homeopathic medicine, which is now so widely opposed for obvious reasons, but it is something that absolutely works. And how is homeopathic medicine prepared? Let's remember. First, however, I would like to recall an episode involving an acquaintance of mine who came to me one day completely immobilized by lumbago and unable to even speak or breathe, because every time his chest expanded in an attempt to breathe, he felt terrible pain, let's say at the base of his spine or in the muscle bands around it. I suggested he take some homeopathic arnica that I had at home, and that I know works very well in these cases. He was very skeptical, and is very skeptical about the subject, but since he couldn't even reply because he was unable to speak, he dissolved these few white globules on his tongue, and less than 10 minutes later he started eating with us, chatting, laughing, drinking wine. When I pointed out this change to him in less than 15 minutes, he naturally denied it and said that he already felt better when he came in. But I'm only mentioning this to better explain how such a medicine is prepared. So we start with the arnica plant, which homeopathic doctors have found to be very effective in cases of trauma, both physical and psychological. So if someone falls or twists their ankle and their back seizes up, arnica is almost always recommended in that case. And how do they proceed? How do pharmaceutical companies that produce homeopathic medicines proceed? They take a drop of the mother substance arnica, i.e. Extracted directly from the arnica leaf, and put 1 drop of arnica in 100 drops of distilled water. Pay attention to this step, which is very important. Then they shake the test tube vigorously. This is the electromagnetic information we want to focus on, because without this shaking of the test tube, i.e. if the drop of arnica was simply dropped into 100 drops of distilled water, no therapeutic effect would be obtained. Instead, as homeopathic doctors explain, that electric shock given to the test tube, that shaking produces electromagnetic waves that fix the medicine in the memory of the water, because water has a memory which has been proven and can be demonstrated and preserves it. So what happens next? This is the 100th dilution. Then a drop from this test tube is taken and placed in another 100 drops of distilled water. It is more accurate to say double distilled author's note. It is shaken again. Then another electric shock, so to speak, is applied. And then a drop from the second test tube is taken and placed in 100 drops of distilled water from the third test tube. This process is repeated 30 times. We obtain a 30 CH dilution, a centesimal dilution of 30 times the dose of arnica, precisely 30 CH, but we know that it is possible to reach 100,000 dilutions and beyond. Of course, scientists dispute this because, as I recall, after the 7th or 8th dilution, according to Avogadro's law, the mother substance no longer exists as a molecule. So one should ask, how is it that even at 30 CH, not to mention 200 CH or 1000 CH, which are even more powerful than 30 CH, it is possible to achieve such a miraculous physical improvement as I described a few words ago? It is achieved through the memory of water. So here is my possible explanation for RSMs. When the sun returns to itself, we store the energy of that place and that moment, and then we release or expend that energy over the course of a whole year. That is an annual cycle until the next return, because practically the same thing happens as at birth, as Emilio del Giudici and Nicola del Giudici have explained. When a child is born, it does not yet have its own stars, because it is still attached to the umbilical cord and takes nourishment from its mother. Let's say that the stars are still the mother's. They are not the child's. But the moment the child breathes independently for the first time, the stars above him at that moment produce an imprint on the water inside him, which is thus memorized on those stars. And that imprint the natal sky will never abandon throughout the subject's life, the information it received at the moment of birth. In the same way, in searching for an explanation, I also return to birth, but starting from the last step, the solar revolution, which, as we now understand, is my life's mission. By combining these different types of knowledge, I believe I have managed to explain how it happens, that in a single instant. When there is a refresh, when the sine wave returns to the alpha point, i.e. the 0 point of the curve, then at that moment the refresh we receive takes on the characteristics of that place and that instant, as at the moment of birth. However, the moment of birth will influence our entire life, And this, on the other hand, is a modulation that lasts a year in relation to the annual biorhythm of the Earth revolving around the Sun. It is obvious that scientists and official science would make mincemeat of this. If I were to kneel down and ask for their blessing, as some of my opponents mistakenly thought during the debates I have held, which I was invited to hold during my lifetime, I explained to them that I didn't care, that I wasn't interested in having the approval of official science, the rosette from these sheriff gentlemen. I'm writing this for the benefit of my fellow astrologers, of future generations who, starting from these considerations, will be able, if they succeed, to identify a group of 7, 8, 10 brains of the caliber I have mentioned, and will be able to continue along this path and put together a general and precise theory on the functioning of astrology. Note 1. Here are the precise numbers given to me by ChatGPT, the artificial intelligence with which I often converse. Jupiter is much larger than Pluto. Jupiter's diameter is about 143,000 kilometers, while Pluto's diameter is about 2,376 kilometers. So in terms of diameter, Jupiter is about 60 times larger than Pluto. However, when it comes to volume, the difference is even greater. The volume of a planet is proportional to the cube of its radius, which is half the diameter. So if Jupiter has a diameter about 60 times larger than Pluto's, its volume will be 63, or about 216,000 times larger than Pluto's. In other words, you could fit about 216,000 Plutos inside Jupiter, and for distance, the distance from Earth to Jupiter and from Earth to Pluto varies, depending on their position in their respective orbits around the Sun. The average distance between Earth and Jupiter is about 628.7 million kilometers. On the other hand, the average distance between Earth and Pluto is about 5.9 billion kilometers. If we divide the average distance between Earth and Pluto by the average distance between Earth and Jupiter, we get a factor of about 9.4. So on average, Pluto is about 9 to 10 times farther from Earth than Jupiter. However, this is only a rough estimate, as the actual distance can vary greatly depending on the specific positions of the planets in their orbits